Product conversations. Uh, May, this is a conversation you and I have been having for a while, and we haven't done covered it really on product conversations in probably 2 3 years. But with a lot of things going on in our industry, technology right now, and in society as a whole, we really decided it was time to bring back ethics, and more specifically, ethics of product management and the decisions we need to make. Uh, you've helped put together an amazing panel. Obviously, you and Steve are regulars, but Radhika Dutt from Radical Product, one a
Focus.
great book, and also a great every podcast she's been on, I've really enjoyed, and Cliff Gilley. And so we're going to dig into the ethics of Cliff Gilley from Gartner. I should probably do that because
Oh,
he's taking his time
it's
to
okay.
be with us.
It's totally
I
fine.
should probably I should probably get into it. One quick thing, just to if people are on LinkedIn, they may be seeing it. I've joined a company called Outsell, focused on running one of their verticals, but also I'm the product management lead there. Steve is still doing product growth leaders, but one of the terms of that was that we kept doing this. And so thanks to Outsell for being a partner to help me keep doing these things I love doing. And thanks to Steve for continuing to be an amazing partner for product growth leaders. So a couple big things there. May, as we start, I'd love to sort of get your take. This was I would call it a passion topic for you, with everything that's going on right now, and there's so much relevance to product management with it. I'd like to give you the floor a little to sort of, you know, talk to us about why this is so important to you.
So I think for most product managers, we've been asked to do something that we feel like isn't the best possible thing we could possibly do. Sometimes whoever's asking you to do something else is right. And other times there's just like this nagging feeling in the back of your head, right? And those feelings add up over time. And also, it's not just you feeling those feelings, it's probably the people doing the work. So, all your designers, your developers, your team, right? The choices that we make and the conversations that we have and the decisions we make, whether or not to have those conversations, have a really strong impact on our team, right? Like in these conversations, we talk a lot about psychological safety and how people feel about it. So I think if we kind of take a step back and not really like talk about a wider field of, you know, not necessarily this is completely right and this is completely wrong, but to have those conversations about what's important to us as human beings and us as a team of human beings working together and us as an organization of multiple teams of these human beings working together, like, what are we actually trying to build? And is this aligned to what we want to do and who we want to be? Especially coupled with, the massive push from a lot of corporations to like move away from DEI. As a not white, uh, often women identifying, but also queer like person, plus all of the other check boxes that I might check that you might not know of, like how do we go about doing this when you might be asked to do something that's not aligned with who you want to be? Like, what is the harm that we do with our products, knowingly or unknowingly, right? So having those conversations is really critical, I think, especially in this time period, especially with uncertainty, unrest, and whatever might come our way.
Completely, and you even left out the A of DEI, where you're seeing a lot of people add the A to it, and accessibility is something that you and I have talked a ton about when we think about these things. And so, as we look at making these decisions as product leaders and as for our product teams, it's tough out there. We see it's easy to see the examples. I use the example of Steve Jobs saying he didn't let his kids use the iPhone or iPod, right, or iPad because of the addictiveness of it. We've seen the stories of other social media people who are doing this, but we wanted to bring this back to specifically, our community of product leaders, product managers, senior product people, and like have this, I'll call it raw conversation about how should we be addressing these types of things. And the first question I want to ask is, what is product management's responsibility about thinking about ethics in our products? And I'd love to start with Radhika on that. What's our responsibility?
Yeah. Um, for recently, I've heard so many thought leaders even say something like, oh, I'm glad that now about AI, we're not talking about the abstract concepts of ethics and we're talking about practical value. And I'm thinking to myself, goodness gracious, if thought leaders are saying this, imagine, everyone else who hasn't put that much thought into it, right? Why can't we have ethics conversations along with value, right? And ethics conversations are not abstract, don't have to be. So let's talk about what is our responsibility. I think, for most product people, right? There are very, very rare people who actually want to do harm, right? Very rare. Like for most people, everyone wants to be good. So, what happens? The way we think about ourselves is we think about ourselves as ethical heroes in waiting. That one day you're going to be asked to do something blatantly horrible, and you're going to be brave and say, like a hero, no, I'm not going to cross this line in the sand, right? And the reality is, that is not how ethics works in product. You're never going to get a chance to be that ethical hero who's asked to do something that is just outrageous or truly, where you can draw a line in the sand and say, no, I won't do it. The reality is, how unethical products come about is because of a series of small decisions that seem inconsequential at the time, right? And
Mhm.
so, and I'll give you an example. Let's look at the example of WhatsApp. And this is one of the reasons I don't use WhatsApp. So, if you look at WhatsApp, the founders, when they built it, they knew that they were storing metadata. They were storing metadata about people's, who calls whom, how often. They upload your entire contact list to their servers. And they knew how sensitive this data was, right? Because at the time, one of the co founders actually said, I can't imagine Facebook or anyone buying us and getting hold of this sensitive information. We would never sell. That's what they said. Well, they didn't sell until they did, right? Like a $19 billion offering is quite a bit to say no to. And at that point, the ethical consideration was, well, if we said no to a 19 billion offer, we're being unethical to all of our employees who have worked so hard. So, you what is our responsibility, right? Our responsibility as product people is to recognize one, that you'll never get to be that product hero, that your definition needs to change of what is a hero, that an ethical person is someone who's going to have to not just make one big decision as a hero one day, but fight for those small things along the way, at each step. It's this constant small decisions that you have to be a hero towards. And the second thing is, more broadly, we have to realize that what we're doing is extremely powerful. When you're working like a cog in a big machine, you think, oh, my part. A friend of mine who works at Google literally said this to me. Oh, I just work on identity. I don't feel like I'm doing anything unethical. And I'm thinking, this is Google's identity product that you're working on. How do you not realize like how big a piece of this puzzle you are, right? We think I'm just this little thing, right? And so we have to realize that as product people, we're building a product, and that product responsibility is almost like a doctor, where a doctor says to a patient, I see you have this problem. I am creating this solution for you. This is my treatment plan. And and this is my treatment plan. And if you take this, you'll get better, right? They don't then go say, well, whatever happens to you, good luck, go find someone else. And so our responsibility is like that, like a doctor. We look at our sick patients and we say, I see you have a problem. I'm recommending my product to you. We can't then go say, oh, well, good luck, what happens to you. It's all about how you use it. So that's my view on what is our responsibility. I realized that was long,
I,
but I'd love to
no,
hear everyone else's thoughts.
I love it, and it made me think that there's, I am almost too close minded on strategy. right? And the strategy type things. And the reality is, just like we need to create boundary conditions with our strategies to enable and empower our product management teams to make better decisions, we need to do the same when it comes to ethical behavior and of the product and what we're expecting. You know, what are those boundary conditions? What are those guide rails that help make it? And I guess part of it means your company has to have some at least stake in the ground, and that may be one of the issues we're having right now is people pulling stakes out. Uh, Cliff, I'd love to get to you on the same question. What is product management's responsibility? And feel free to yes and.
Yeah, so I approach the question of ethics here from a actually what I think is a rather unique perspective. I'm a former lawyer, right? And lawyers have a lot of I know everyone's going to laugh at that, but the reality is there are a lot of ethical rules that lawyers have to follow. And what you learn really quickly as a lawyer is there's a difference between morality and ethics. And I think what we sometimes do when we're talking about ethics in product is we're confusing the two. A good example, this is a very extreme example. Some states have for lawyers a rule that allows them, if they choose to disclose a future crime that will cause great bodily harm. They're not required to. That decision is a moral decision, whether I choose to disclose or not. In other states, I must disclose. That is an ethical decision, whether I disclose or not. So I think we forget we mix those together often, and they are intertwined in many ways. But I think when I think of ethics in product management, I see the product manager as having the most exposure to the most potential issues because we kind of sit in that hub and spoke model, right? We're in the middle of marketing stuff and sales stuff and development stuff and strategy stuff and finance stuff. We have a perspective that's unique in most situations that we can kind of see what's going on in all of these different places. So I think we have a responsibility to call those things out as we see them developing, even if they're not within our frame of reference, even if we're not making a product decision. If we see marketing using some method that seems itchy to me, right? We should raise that flag and say, hey, this doesn't seem right to me. What's explain? Can you explain to me why we're doing this way? Why are we creating a an addictive pattern in our product? Oh well, it'll increase engagement. Well, yeah, but at what cost? And I think this might be more leaning into the B2C stuff. I don't think we see a lot of addictive patterns in B2B products. Maybe we need more, but we have a perspective on more than just what's within our frame of reference, right? We're not just a doctor diagnosing one patient. We're a doctor diagnosing a whole family. And we need to see the connections between those family members. If one person has tuberculosis, right? We need to separate them from the rest of the family. There's no choice. There's no alternative there. So I think that's kind of my perspective on it. And I think ethical decisions, even the small ones, can be really, really hard because people don't like to be challenged on those things. They don't like someone saying, hey, this is an addictive pattern and maybe we should do something different.
I think I agree with all that. And I think even in B2B, I've seen maybe it's not addictive patterns. I've seen people who makes part of their money on ad revenue
Yeah.
tweak search to serve more ad things. And maybe it reduces the efficacy of the search, but it shows more ads. I've seen people, the toll meter on usage, if it's a usage based product, sort of going and hold for a while and adding a 10% buffer of usage, right? Which is purely gaming the system, right? So I think it's both B2C and B2B. I've seen it in both. And it may be, my B2B world. I put that in my post earlier this week. I came from GE, both early in my career and then as an executive. And, there's something about, I go back to May's post on doing the right thing, right? And I'm, as a Drucker person, I believe that we all starts with the customer and we want to deliver value to the customer. And that's sort of the equation. If we deliver value for the customer, they will return that value through a buying us a subscription or whatever it may be, right? And when you cross that 50-50, who's getting more value, I mean, I see that as an ethical thing. If we start degrading our products like Boeing, right, and all, that's an ethical thing to me.
Mhm.
So I think that it's all over the place. I love your use of the wheel. And for those of you who haven't seen Cliff's presentation from industry, he did a post on it earlier this year. I'll find it. I'll put it in the comments. His visual of the spoke about how product management really is this ultra cross-functional, really helping the whole organization work together. Tremendous. And so I do it. And I love how you brought it back here, because we do see everything, but we also see ourselves and the decisions we make and how we make better decisions.
Grant, I love what
Steve,
you said
I'd love
about.
to get your take on the responsibility.
Go ahead, Radhika.
I
Go
loved
ahead.
what you said about B2B, and this is just as much a problem in B2B. I think the underlying question we have to ask ourselves as product people is, what is the effect that I'm creating on society with each feature? So it's not necessarily an addictive pattern. Like, I don't think we just look out for that. I think we have to ask that fundamental question of, like, what is the effect on society? Like, if I think like a chess game, a few steps out, what's going to happen? And if we don't, very often we just don't have the bandwidth, and therefore don't think about this chess game thinking like 7 steps out, what is going to happen in society because of this feature that I'm adding?
Just to
Steve, go ahead.
clarify, I was
Yeah.
only using the addictive pattern as an example and only saying B2B doesn't addictive patterns don't apply to B2B. Not that ethical or moral questions don't apply. I think probably they apply greater to B2B contexts, because like the Boeing thing, right? The potential impacts for a bad ethical decision in a B2B product are significantly greater than a B2C product in my mind.
It's about outcomes, right? Like
Mhm.
when we talk about product, we talk about product outcomes. And outcomes also include negative outcomes, and those negative outcomes we also call consequences, right? And it's like consequences for our customers, which means consequences for us, consequences for society, which means consequences for all of us. And like what are the, like, having that conversation about what is the consequences of us releasing something like this, especially if there's like any like nagging thought in the back of your head, like just maybe talk about it, right?
Having a conversation is one of the best ways to deal with it, right? Have the hard conversation. Steve, you were about to say something.
Yeah, I think the conversation is absolutely right. And I have found that in my world, developers and QA people are hugely sensitive to ethical behavior and morality, for that matter. And yet, for years, I have referred to our customers as customers instead of users. And maybe we really should go back to the term users in this context. No other industry refers to their customers as users except for drug dealers. But I prefer to think of them as customers and partners rather than victims of our products. That's all.
I love that.
In B2B, isn't that what they are? I mean, a lot of the time, like, I've worked for so many B2B companies that said, well, they're not the buyers, so why do we need to improve our UX? In fact, our product looking like Excel is a selling point because that's what our users are used to. I That is actually an almost direct quote from from a marketing talk I had.
I want
But
to go
they
back
don't.
to some.
They also don't. As Radhika points out, we don't have bandwidth for it, but we also don't teach it. I
Yeah.
can't think of a time when the leader of my company has told us who we are, what we believe, and I think Simon Sinek calls it out. We at the core is, why do we do the things we do? And I honestly want to believe. I honestly don't believe that the people creating Facebook intended it to be used for so much hate. I'm sure social media didn't start with hate. It's just a happy consequence, I suppose.
Well, see, I feel like whenever we're ready to forgive ourselves and dismiss issues by saying, oh, this is an unintended consequence, it's basically that we have done a half-assed job and not thought through the
Totally.
issues like a chess game, like 7 steps forward, what's going to happen. It's like being that doctor who says, yeah, this should work out. Let's just give you this medication and see how it goes. Like you haven't thought through what is it going to do to that person's quality
And
of
that's what
life, right?
happened when they connected the internet to whatever the guy was in Terminator. We'll just
So
try
it's
this one thing.
it's interesting though, because I mean there's a spectrum, right? There absolutely are things that we, with all due diligence and all ability that we currently have to see what's going on, could not reasonably foresee, right? It's kind of like the Rumsfeld known knowns, known unknowns, unknown unknowns,
Mhm.
right? There are things that we can't. But to think that, and we know that Facebook took steps to minimize harm at the beginning and in I'll say middle phase. They took, whether they were sufficient or not, that's a whole question. But they did take steps. They had teams of people who were large teams of people who were
That they
dedicated
listen to?
to,
Okay.
again the implement. Now I'm not. Let me be clear. I'm not defending Facebook, but what I'm saying is we know that they took steps, and we know that they then removed those steps.
Yeah.
Similar to Quora. Quora was a great place when they had their Be Nice BNBR, whatever that was, their
Mhm.
policy, where if you insulted someone, your comment, answer, question was removed within 10 minutes or so. Back in the early days, it was a great place to be.
Mhm.
And then guess what? They found out that having people do this work costs money, and our revenues aren't matching that. So what are we going to do? We're going to cut back on that facilitation team. We're going to cut back on that team, and now, quite frankly, it's kind of a bit of a cesspool
Mhm.
because there is no BNBR. There are no rules about engagement. If you call someone a nasty name, it stays. If you ask a question
Yeah.
about why is someone, a leading question that doesn't exist, it just stays there forever. So
But I think one thing maybe we can all agree on is that the less we think deeply, the more unknown
yes,
unknowns there are.
yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, no,
Well, Rumsfeld, of course, there are lots of unknown unknowns because they didn't want to think about what's
but if
actually
we
going to
don't take time, yes, that's actually where I was leading
It,
to, is we need to take the time to minimize the unknown unknowns and identify the known unknowns so that they become known knowns.
And
and
prioritize that as an important thing,
Yes.
not something
yes.
to do on the weekends when you're idle, for that 15 minutes on the weekend, but
And,
to make it
right.
part of our discussion.
And also on top of that, right? Like unknown unknowns are unknown to us, the people who are
Yes.
thinking about it. The more people we talk to, the fewer
The more we
unknown
can find.
unknowns there are because other people actually already know it, or other people have been at least thinking
Well,
about it.
that moves it to the unknown knowns, which now can be part of our decision making to make them known knowns until we can address that. Thank you, Donald
Mhm.
Rumsfeld, the other Donald Rumsfeld, for
Yeah.
at least one positive contribution to society in the Rumsfeld matrix. It was interesting. I was watching a video with the guys from South Park doing a storytelling thing, and basically they said is we did this, then this happened, then this happened, and I think, Radhika, when you talk about let's map out those steps, that's exactly what it is. It's like, okay, if we do this, what's next, right? And maybe this is a pitch for more UX researchers, right? To people to be thinking about how this plays out. But I want to go back to where Cliff was earlier, talking about the hub and the spokes and how we work with it. It's where do these conversations come into play? How do these conversations come into play? How do we as product management, product leaders, make sure the conversations are happening?
So can I just add to what you said before we continue to this hub and
Yeah,
spoke
please
model?
go
Just
ahead.
what you said about maybe in terms of processes, this means we need more UX research or UX researchers. But I think in terms of processes, every product person, right? Whether even you're a developer or you're a product manager, in whatever way you're involved in building a product, it can become part of your process to think through a feature, to
Mhm.
think
Yeah.
5 steps ahead and say, okay, if I do this, then what's going to happen? And then what's going to happen? Like if you ask those, we're supposed to ask those 5 whys, right? Of why is something important?
Mhm.
Let's then think about the outcomes in the same way. Like ask a few, and then as a result, like what happens, right? If we ask those questions, we're less likely to, and if, by the way, we say we don't know, that's where we go to May's point. Go talk to other people and figure out, what do others see happening, right? I think we can make this part of our process in
Mhm.
building so that it becomes a way of thinking and how we approach features.
That
100%.
reminds me of a
Totally
quote.
agree.
I can't remember where it came from, so I would credit it if I could. But is culture is what happens when you're not paying attention.
Mm.
Ethics is what happens when you're not paying attention.
Mhm.
Right? You can't. This needs to be something not just in a process. This needs to be internalized within the organization. And I think
Mhm.
I'll say it. That's where the problem lies. The problem lies in the number one value of the corporation being create value for the shareholders.
Right.
Yep.
Because if that's our number one value and if that's all that we care about, then ethics doesn't play any role in that.
And I'll be,
We now have a fiduciary responsibility, and our ethical rules are do everything to make more money.
and that's why I use the GE example from my experience there, because there's been books written on how Jack Welch is sort of the cause of the downfall of capitalism and where it may be, and the impact of the GE finance shareholder focused view. And so, is it that black and white? Is it purely when that line goes and I'm going to go back. I agree that there aren't the high majority, 99+% of the people aren't evildoers who were wanting to do this, but there are some of those out there. Is this shareholder thing, is that the line that once it crosses 50% focus, it just swirls and gets out of control, sort of exponentially? Is there some other factor than shareholder value?
Oh, there's a
I
lot. But go ahead,
I have a
Radhika.
counter quote to the to the GE example of adding shareholder value as being the main goal, right? As a person, as an employee, we have to realize what is our
Yes.
what how do we think about our work? And the way I think we need to think about our work is we are voting for the world we want to create with our labor. That is such an important way of thinking about our own work. Like, I'm voting for the world I want to create with my labor. Vote responsibly, right? that's that's one of the main things we can think about. And so, yes, whatever the company's fiduciary responsibility is, you have to decide what is your vote that you want to cast. And you can try to shape your company and what decisions you make as much as possible. But ultimately, you're making a choice. You are voting the way you want to. I think that's how we need to think about it.
I just was writing that down because I wanted to remember it when we came to our key takeaways and learnings, because I think that one's going to be a key one for me. Steve? And then
My
Cliff.
dad spent his entire career at GE, originally under Reginald Jones and then later under Jack Welch. And it was so interesting in the turnover. Reginald Jones said to Jack Welch and to everyone, we have 4 customer bases. We have 4 constituencies. One is our stockholders, one is our customers, one is our employees, and one is the community in which we live.
Mm.
And Jack said, I completely agree with all of those except for the
Except
the other 3. Right.
That's the other three.
And
And
this is not the Jack Welch bashing episode, but if it
right.
happens.
No, but it was it was kind of reacting to there's more constituents than just stockholders, right? And I mean, and I loved this aspect of not only our employees and our customers, but our community. I mean,
Yeah.
in those days, and maybe still, GE was one of 2 or 3 major employers in every town they were in, and being part of that town was part of their ethos.
I love what you said. And I want to address the question of as a product person or as a company or as a CEO, what is in it for me to think about those last three constituents, which is the customer, the community, and my employees, right? So why should I think about them? And the answer to me lies in a wonderful term coined by Cory Doctorow. And the term is enshittification.
I've been waiting for that. I've been waiting for that word.
What happens when we don't consider those constituents, where we're only focused on shareholder value, is we create enshittification in our product, right? And we've seen
Yep.
this happen in Facebook, where, you know, if you're only optimizing for shareholder value, at some point you piss off enough consumers and you piss off enough advertisers that then there starts to be a network effect on people dropping off from the platform, right? And so this happens in most products. Unless you have a monopoly, and which is what every company tries to get towards. Like, how do I build a monopoly so I don't have to worry about everyone fleeing my product and create enshittification freely, right? Let's
Yeah.
look at airlines. This is what they do. They have a monopoly or an oligopoly, and which is why the product continues to get shittier over time, and we don't have any other way to travel if we need to fly, right? And you're stuck with a shittified product. But if you don't have a monopoly, you know, as a product person, as a CEO, you have to consider these constituents so that you don't fall into the trap of enshittification and overall contribute to enshittification in society.
The other thing I think I want to draw attention to is that as an individual working, right? How much of your I've done the math on this because of course I have. And say you work 40 hours a week and you get 5 weeks of vacation a year and you don't do any overtime. You will spend 20% of your adult life in total working. 20% of your working years is spent at work. And whatever you do in that time is your working legacy. 1/5 of your life is devoted to whatever it is that you do, that you get paid for. That's how you survive, but that's also your legacy. So this is what you're leaving behind in the world, because this is what, like, choice or not choice, it's still what you've chosen to do. And so the outcomes and the impact of the work that we do, the outcomes and the impact of the conversations that we chose not to have, that adds up. And like the more people we get talking about their feelings and the things that they're concerned about, and like, you know, if you're working in like physical manufacturing and then there is a lot of toxic waste coming out, like maybe talk about that. But it's not even just physical. Like, let's talk about the world of AI and how much power and water and land use that happens, especially when the data centers are in places that don't have enough water, right? What does this mean for us? What does this mean for you who live
society.
there?
Mhm.
Yeah, the society, the people that you live with, your family, your friends. You know, like what happens to you?
I
What
thought
happens to
DeepSeek was going to
us?
fix all that.
Oh, there's actually new data that that is actually going to consume more. It depends on what computing you're doing, and there are certain computations which actually cost a lot more or are more energy consumption.
Yeah, and so like we often sever like the physical reality when we talk about software product management, because we say, well, we just pay Amazon to deal with it,
Mhm.
right?
It's
We pay.
interesting.
We externalize those choices and we diffuse the responsibility. That's what we do almost
Yeah,
always
it's
because
outsourced
It,
operational risk. It's
yep.
literally built into like the financial finance computations around operational risk. Outsourcing the environmental factors, outsourcing your climate obligations to your shareholders, whatever you promise them. Like, it's all outsourced and it's not real.
it's interesting. This is how much is coming back to tell to. My mind's going crazy. It's like this is like these are problems we've dealt with in product management for decades. Not exactly ethics, but similar things. Steve, I always remember the story you used to always tell about if you work at a place where the president and the sales team comes in every quarter and changes your roadmap and makes you deliver stuff that's not delivering value for one client, at some point you realize that that's what the culture is and you have to leave,
Mhm.
right? You
Mhm.
have to make that tough decision. Same exact thing when it comes to this.
I agree. I was actually thinking of that earlier. We are free agents. Every year, I think you need to make the decision to stay on with this team or move away. And when you encounter ridiculous behavior or immoral behavior, you're like, I don't want to hang with these people. And it's always a good time to be thinking about, is this where I want to spend so much of my life, as May points out?
Yeah,
And
love
yet, to
that
the
right.
bigger
point.
point, the things that we do are impacting the community at large. And, I keep coming back to Asimov's zeroth law, which is, robots and, for that matter, product managers should not do things that harm society.
Radhika, were you
I
going to
Oh,
say
come
something?
on.
Or did you go?
Little nerd thing. Come on.
I,
I love
I,
it.
I, I had a joke lined up. I just couldn't pull it because I didn't want to offend our older audience who has read Asimov.
I love what you said that, in the end, like you have to make a choice, right? That you don't have to choose to work there. I think, like, one thing that I've seen happen with good friends of mine, right? A lot of these companies, the FANGs, they're able to pay lots. And therefore, there are these golden handcuffs where they feel like,
Mhm.
oh, if I had to take a job elsewhere, I'd be taking a pay cut, right? To which I really do empathize with that. I mean, we all have responsibility to feed our families, etc. But I think there is one question we kind of have to ask ourselves, which is you have to make an effort if you have the privilege of being either a software developer or a product person. Usually it's easier to find a job. You have to have the moral courage to start looking for another job if you really don't like what you're doing. You can't just assume, like, oh, you know what, they pay me so well, I'm not going to make the effort to look elsewhere, and still feel like you're being ethical about it, right? Like, I totally empathize with the need for a paycheck. We can't all just say, we quit every job we could think of, but like make choices, like do something towards making a choice.
And the other part
The
about that is
the
the longer you stay in that environment, the more you are internalizing the values of that environment. So,
yeah.
and that's something we don't often think of. I'm also a psych soc major, so psych soc law. I'm in my element here. We the more I mean the,
Renaissance man, my
you stare in
Renaissance man,
yeah
Cliff.
you stare into the abyss stares back into you, right? That's absolutely true. The more you expose yourself and allow yourself to externalize these decisions and say, well, that's someone else's problem, that's Amazon's problem, that's the CEO is making those decisions, I don't have power. The more you internalize that over time, and it just becomes
You give up your
your world,
agency.
you give up that agency, you give up, not that you can't retake it, not that you can't decide today I'm not going to put up with this anymore and I'm going to go try to find something that's more fulfilling, but it does slowly eat away at you from a moral and ethical perspective, and
Oh my
you start to become the cog in the wheel and the thing that makes value for shareholders.
You're so right. I have to share this experience, right? So, and I was reading this article in New York Times where they were talking about kids from Harvard and MIT feeling proud that they're being sellouts. That okay, they're gonna go work at hedge funds and investment banks now, but it's only to earn enough so that they can then give back to society, right? And the analysis in the article was basically that you go to these
They
hedge
never.
funds and investment banks and your lifestyle changes, and what ends up happening at the end is you change as a person,
Yep.
and you no longer hold those same values. What giving back to you at some point means is donating to Carnegie Hall. So um the point is, like, if we want to actually do good, like, it's not one of those things where I'll first do this and then eventually I'll think about giving back. You change as a person. So I love what you said, and this is what has happened to a lot of friends that I had from MIT. We used to do brunches together, and then a lot of them moved to New York, became investment bankers, And all of a sudden, I realized I had nothing in common with these people
Yep.
anymore. Our conversations at brunches were, these people telling me about how much their suits cost. I didn't know these kids anymore. We were all on tiny budgets as students. That's where the bonding was.
And it doesn't take
Yeah,
long. Like, I mean, I look back at my law school career, like I went to a relatively small regional school. There were about 300 people in my class. I would say of them going in, probably 50 to 75 were all about changing the world, righting the wrongs, fighting for the environment. And by the end, I'd say that number was around 5 to 10,
Yeah.
because the
uh,
reality of the debt, the reality of where you're going to make money, that second year internship where you actually had to do the work, like it changes you in a shockingly short period of time.
so a couple of things. I've got so many things in my head right now, and one of them is a Milton from The Office Space. His final thing before he took agency was them taking the stapler, and I can't get that out of my head. It was the stapler was his trigger. But going back into where we look at this, it's about you know there's a book called "What Should I Do with My Life" by Poe Bronson.
Hmm.
It is probably my most given book, like to give to people. And he talks exactly about that. He goes, everybody who said they were going to go make their money and then pursue their dreams never does. And what he did was he interviewed all these people. And I'm going to try to pull this back to our conversation today, which has gone a totally different way than I thought it was going to go. But I love where it is. But he said that what he did is he interviewed a whole, hundreds of people, but focused on, I think, 20 people who made major, actually, it was 19 people who made major career changes in their midlife, 40s and 50s, and one person who never changed, just to find what were the motivations for these people to make major changes. And we're talking an investment banker to a catfish farmer, a corporate lawyer to a long haul truck driver, right? This type of stuff. And I think, and maybe this is me, like the reality, and we see it with our product leaders in transition stuff. The reality is there's a lot of people who were disaffected, right? They are either people over 50. What we're seeing is they're not getting the calls, they're not getting the callbacks, they're not. It's like a lot of people with great senior knowledge are not, right?
Well,
And
we
so,
certainly don't want experience involved when we
no, but
hire, right?
so my trying to bring this all the way back to this conversation is, boy, wouldn't it be wonderful for us to everybody to easily take agency, and if they saw something that was unethical, or they were forced to make a decision that they thought was unethical, they could easily do that and pick up and take their stapler, and burn the place down, and go find a new job. And it's in this economy right now, it's difficult. Uh, so I'd love to sort of use the last, you know, 10 minutes or so, or, part of it, just to say, like, how do we do that? How can a product manager uh, push back when they're asked to be doing something they feel is wrong or unethical, right? How can we empower? May, you want to?
I think it's if you're pushing back, it's too late.
Yep.
Okay.
Because if you're pushing back, it means you're not being proactive, right? Like when you are being asked to do something, generally speaking, it's if it's not like the whole market's completely changed because COVID just started, or whatever. There's a trade war. There, I'm in Canada, so this is very real for me. So the whole notion is that if you are a product manager and you have a strategy, and that strategy is the most relevant and impactful thing you could possibly do in a positive direction, then like chances are someone throwing curveballs at you can mostly be handled, right? Like because you've gotten that buy-in, you've gotten that strategic alignment, you've done that work. And so a part of doing that work is getting that buy-in. And the part of getting that buy-in is talking to people about where we want to go as a company, like that strategic direction across the board, across the organization, and then also down to like your teams and having those conversations about what is the best thing we can do as a team given our respective skills and focuses. What can we do to move the needle in that way? And so when we talk about those levels of autonomy, those levels of agreement and alignment, right? It's a lot of that comes back into the organizational culture and what's deeply valuable to them. Because, like, yes, there are places where it's just about shareholder value, but like 9 times out of 10, most of the people are already checked out. When we talk about places that are actually building things that are innovating, you can't have an innovation thing based on making the top line go up because people don't care, right? Like the people who've cared have already gone somewhere else that where they feel inspired.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, like, if you really want to move the needle, if you really want to go fast, if you really want to innovate, you got to let people have that autonomy. You got to talk about the why. People have to feel like they're aligned with whatever it is they're doing, at least a little bit, right?
I think there's another approach too, and that is like, product managers tend to have more autonomy than other people in organizations if they're actually product managers and not just backlog runners. Okay. You don't have to talk about the ethics when you're making these decisions. You can do shadow ethics behind the scenes in your prioritization decisions and never mention the fact that you're concerned about the environmental impact of generative AI. What I'm really concerned about is whether or not we're going to deliver sufficient customer value, right? I can mask my ethical decisions in ways that don't make me the target of other people in the organization, right? And I think that's what people are most worried about, especially right now, is that waving that environment flag puts a target on my back. Waving that DEI flag puts a target on
Mm-hmm.
my back. But I can make decisions about accessibility without talking about accessibility. I can make decisions about generative AI without talking about the environmental impacts. I can make decisions about facilitation and editing without saying that out loud. And I want to give people a little bit of hope here because I think we've talked a lot about how difficult it is and how challenging it is and how we struggle with these things. But if you if you know yourself, if you know your values, and you want to reflect them in your decisions, you can do it. You can do it in ways that don't call it out, that don't put a target on your back. And if you can't, if you literally cannot do that, that's when you have to think, to Steve's point, about is this the environment I want to continue to remain in? Because
Yeah.
if you can't make those decisions under the covers, even, you're probably in a horribly dysfunctional organization anyway. But add on top of that the decisions that they're making that are affecting everyone around us.
I love what you described. And I want to add a little bit more in terms of the tools that you can do where you can bake equity into your product, but you don't necessarily have to call out the details. When opportunities arise, I think it is great to build that awareness so your whole team is
Mhm.
also thinking about it. But if it is going to place a target on your back and you really, really cannot, well, at least for yourself, you will feel better if you have thought through how am I baking equity into my product, right? And
Yeah.
so for all those of you who are feeling exhausted and overwhelmed by work and just how soul sucking your work is, this is your your retaliation, right? Where even just like Cliff was saying, for yourself, as you think about strategy, what May said about being proactive, you can do all of that. Work on a strategy on your piece of paper and think about how are you baking equity into it. And I'll explain what I mean in terms of a strategy. In the Radical Product Thinking book, I talk about the RDCL or radical strategy, where R stands for real pain points. When you think about the real pain points, think about also marginalized people. Think about people who you typically might not be thinking about. And how is your product or feature going to affect them? That might lead you in terms of design, which is the D in the RDCL, you might think about accessibility, but that's not the only thing. You might think about like, how is it going to affect marginalized communities? What May was giving that example of, well, all of this generative AI is going to suck water out of those communities where they need that water and there isn't that much, right? So think about the D and like, what does this mean for your solution, your design? Then the C for capabilities is where, as you're building partnerships, right, you can think about, are these partnerships win-win situations, or are you extracting like colonialism? Facebook is an example. They've installed Wi-Fi in so many countries like Myanmar, but it was an extractive approach because they installed Wi-Fi, gave people access to Facebook, but then it ended up propagating so much violence, right? Like that's not a win-win. Like what kind of win-win partnerships can you create? And then lastly, in terms of logistics, this is where you think about the business model. Am I creating a business model, again, where I'm extracting in terms of my communication approach? Am I addressing all of the marginalized communities too? Like, how am I thinking about being inclusive? So that's your RDCL strategy. And then lastly, right, even when you're thinking about optimization and what metrics are you measuring for success, what I see so often is we measure success based on daily active users or user engagement, right? And really, those are shitty metrics to measure because, if I have a high daily active users or a low number, it's not telling me what's really working or not working in the product. So think about, what am I learning from my metrics? Like, what am I genuinely learning in terms of what I do better or what should I change? What's the course correction? Right? Asking those questions of, what have I learned? What assumptions are true? And what would I do to course correct? Like, those are the three questions we have to ask ourselves in terms of metrics. Don't just blindly optimize for shareholder value and create enshittification. So those are my tips for how can you, for yourself, create a less soul-sucking environment.
Thank you. Both of you have given me this. I was going to go to this whole, wow, how the importance of mission and values in a corporate strategy. And, but it really helped pull me back to, it's like, what can each of us do, right? Each individual. And, there's the Margaret Mead quote, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world.
And
Indeed,
that's
it's the only thing that ever has.
yeah, and that's the key, right? You might be feeling this way and you're probably not alone.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
And
if you
and if
can
you model it, right?
if you can have those safe conversations, like one of my favorite things to do with a new team is, what do we not compromise on, right?
Mhm.
And half the
Yep.
time, like the conversations around data privacy, security, accessibility, those come up. Because even though like it might not be an explicit requirement, like your government contracts require you to do this, right? Your big enterprise contracts require to be accessible, even if you are B2B, right? So there's so many pieces to it that you can have these conversations and say, look, there is an actual financial impact here. There
Yep.
are always ways you can link it back to that finance piece, but it won't happen without you having these conversations.
And in those
No,
conversations, you have to be really careful about espoused theory versus theory in practice, right? We don't sacrifice quality. Yeah, we do. We don't sacrifice accessibility. Yeah, you do. Right? So when you have those conversations about what are our lines, you need to have those conversations when that line is about to be crossed. And something as simple as quality, right, is something that all dev teams sacrifice. They'll say they don't, but if we can start even at those levels, then we can, and we have success, then we can talk about other things. So it's also building that trust, that trusted environment, knowing who to rely on and who not to, having situational awareness about who's in the room, who's not. It's 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 like navigating a minefield, but if you can build that coalition, if you can find the people that care, and this is how I do agile transformations, right? Is I find the people that want to do better, faster, more efficiently. And then I get them to show everyone else how it works. And then
Mm.
other people start to follow. So, I said, do your shadow ethics. Yeah, do your shadow ethics, but also identify those opportunities to talk about what you're doing with other people. and then build that so then it comes out of the shadows and it becomes an explicit part. And then, at some point it may or may not float upwards and it may stop at some level. And then you have to make the decision, is that good enough for me?
No, I love it. And this has been an amazing conversation. We've got a few minutes left, and we always end with sort of what are your key learnings and takeaways. And Cliff, I'm going to start with you. Key learnings and takeaways from the conversation.
Oh man, I really love Radhika's intuition, and she beat me to it. But actually, like the doctor analogy, I think was a really great
Yeah.
one. That we need to not only identify what's wrong, but take actual actions to remedy it, or we're just part of the problem.
I love it. That's great. Radhika, key learning or takeaway?
Can I go after Steve? Like I'm still thinking because there are so many
There's
points
so
I'm
much,
thinking
yeah.
about. It's like where do
No,
I start? I really love
no,
this
I completely
conversation.
agree. Well,
Okay,
I will
I
let
have
you. I
one.
will let you take your
I
pass,
have
and we'll come
one though,
back to you.
and I might come back. I might reserve the right to add one more afterwards. I love this concept of shadow ethics, because it's
Yeah,
actually kind of it's what do you call it? It's a contradiction in itself, right? Like shadow ethics just sounds wrong,
it's
and
like guerrilla warfare, right? I mean, but it's
right,
like,
guerrilla ethics. It's ridiculous. That's the state of the world that we're in, and yet,
yeah,
right? It gives me hope. It gives me hope that that can be a way for us to actually overcome some of the soul-sucking aspect of where we are, and I really love that concept. So thank you.
yeah. That was exactly where the Margaret Mead quote came to my head, is when he said that, because we can do this. May.
I really like the idea that right now we're all ethical heroes in waiting and we're just waiting for something to happen. But I think we do need to be proactive. And, when was the last time you've had a conversation on ethics in any capacity?
Mhm.
And I think that, like, not just at work, but also in our communities, with our families, like, let's talk about what it means to what is the right thing, what should we be caring about, because without that conversation we forget that we live in a world with other humans, right? So I think
Yeah,
it's a much bigger problem than just work is a symptom.
yeah. I've got a. I think I shared this with you. May not have. I've got a HuffPo article from January 2017 that I bookmarked, which is why I don't know how to explain to people that you should care about other people.
Yes.
Right? And it's still relevant today. But yeah, Steve.
Well, I think even as a society, we need to think more about we than me. And not everybody looks exactly like me or lives exactly like
Mhm.
me, even if I think maybe they should. Um, but ultimately, I think my takeaway here is be the change you want to see in the world.
I love it.
For years, I've taught people to do a little bit of civil disobedience in product management. I mean, nobody prevents you from uh, providing context around, uh, uh, providing context about our products to the people who need it. Nobody prevents us from having those discussions on, what could be some of the unintended consequences. Let's take a few minutes before we go gallivanting off to build this feature. Let's talk about how it could be misused to hurt others,
Yep.
right? But anyway, I think, be the change you want to see in the world.
I love it. And right now I'm channeling Scott Selhorst. I feel like I wish this was 2 hours, because I feel like we could keep going and the conversation would be incredibly, continue to be incredibly valuable. The two things I took for it, Radhika early on talked about voting for the world you want to make. And, we need to take our agency when it comes to this type of things, and either do some shadow ethics work or guerrilla ethics work, as Cliff was talking about, and try to make the change from within, or be willing to make the tough decision to move somewhere else. And I know that's a tough decision. It's hard, but if we want to live to our morals, to our ethics, to our what's right, each person has to have their own agency for that. So we've past the hour, and I think all of us could continue having this conversation. You know, if there are things that come up, if there are things that you think about that you want to share, use them in the comments. That this sort of the event on LinkedIn becomes its own home for this. And Cliff, Radhika, May, Steve, thank you so much for a very vital and valuable conversation that was, I think, very much needed for me. And looking through some of the comments on LinkedIn, I think it was very valuable for a lot of people in the audience. So thank you guys so much. We do this normally every 2 weeks. And hopefully May will be back leading something in 2 weeks. I'll be traveling. But if you guys have ideas of things you want to talk about, shoot them to May or me. This is my favorite time. Having these conversations, I learn, I grow, I meet new people, and dialogue is, I think, is one of the more important things we need in the world right now. And so thank you so much, everybody, for being here. And we'll see you again in the next product conversation. Take care, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, it stopped.
This was
Radhika, thank you so
awesome.
much.
Thank
That
you
was
so much
wonderful.
for organizing this. I loved it.